Etta, thanks for having me and thanks for inviting me. So today I'm going to talk to you about the research that I've been doing over the past, about 10 years, I guess, this body of work. I would say that I study comparative cognition, meaning that I investigate how cognition develops within the individual and how it also evolves across the species. Is that good? Yep. Okay. You probably know that all too often we study human cognition in isolation from the rest of the animal kingdom, and that's probably because we see ourselves as very special. We are the only bipedal apes who use tools and create rituals. We are self-aware. We have sophisticated communication abilities, and we keep track of time. We can think about the past, plan for the future, think about our own eventual demise as well. So we see ourselves as very separate from the rest of the animal kingdom, and this has led us to investigate our own cognitive capabilities in isolation from most other animals. But you only really have to look at other animal species to see that every single one of our human cognitive capabilities will be expressed in some capacity in another animal. So for instance, elephants we know are fantastic at keeping long-term memory, going back year after year to visit the resting places of their ancestors. Vervet monkeys have something called referential communication. That means they actually label. They have their own words for different predators. So, for example, they have one call for snakes, one for leopards, and one for eagles. And these different calls will promote different behaviors in the rest of the group. So if they shout eagle, the rest of the group will look towards the sky. And if they can shout snake, they'll look to the ground. Corvids, or crows, have been in the media a lot recently about their cognitive capabilities. They're not only tool users, but they're what we call meta-tool users, and that means that not only can they solve a task with a tool, but they can use a tool to gain a tool to solve the goal, meaning that they have to keep sub-goals within their working memories. Dolphins are just one of several species that we know to be self-aware. They recognize themselves in mirrors. They quite like looking at themselves and particularly try to check out areas that they couldn't see without the mirror, like their blowholes in the backs of their mouths. Gorillas create rituals, as do chimpanzees. Gorillas have been seen to chant in groups while eating, and they seem to change their chant based on the quality of the food. And chimpanzees have recently been shown to have some sort of cultural behavior where they've been seen to knock stones on the base of trees, and the stones pile up, leaving these archaeological chimpanzee sites. We don't really know the function of it. There doesn't seem to be a functional use for it, so it's been hypothesized that they're doing some sort of worshipping behavior. So investigating human cognition within an evolutionary framework is very important to me. I think this is important because we all share an evolutionary organ, which is our vertebrate brain. So down deep under those neocortex layers, we all have this vertebrate brain, and it does some very basic functions in common across all vertebrates, including the hindbrain that deals with heart rate and breathing or autonomic sorts of behaviors, a midbrain that's going to integrate your sensory inputs, and a forebrain that does sensory integration, but also that front bit of the forebrain that then extended out evolutionarily largest in humans to form our cerebral cortices and the neocortex. And you can see through the evolutionary lineage that we share those components with every vertebrate in evolutionary history, and they still exist here in the human brain today. One interesting characteristic of our vertebrate brain is that our motor behaviors are lateralized across our two hemispheres. And this appears to be an incredibly old evolutionary trait, and we think it's a pretty good one. And the reason why we think it's good is that it allows for neural efficiency, in that we don't duplicate processes across both hemispheres. It decreases the instances of simultaneous and incompatible responses that you might find in split brain patients, or Captain Kirk here not able to stop slapping himself. It then therefore allows us to have a good parallel process, because you have one side of the brain doing one activity while the other one can do something else. Another evolutionarily old trait is that we know that we have contralateral control of our motor abilities. So the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body and vice versa. And as a result, some of the behaviors that we have that are specific to the left and right hemispheres can manifest on the opposite side of the body. And that's mainly what I'm going to talk to you about today. So over the past couple of decades, a group of researchers in Italy, specifically Giorgio Vallatagara and colleagues, have done loads of research looking at the behaviors of a whole range of vertebrates for motor biases. So what is it that the left and the right hemispheres are doing differently, and how does that manifest on the opposite side of the body? And the conclusions that they've come to, which are now being more widely accepted, is that the right hemisphere became dominant for processing novel and dangerous stimuli within the environment. So for example, if you see something dangerous in the environment, it's the right hemisphere that kicks into action first. And if information is not urgent, it can pass to the left hemisphere, and the left hemisphere became more dominant for things like structured sequences of action, like eating. So we've got the right hemisphere that's dealing with these novel and urgent behaviors like fight and flight. I don't know if anybody's seen the cat and cucumber videos on Instagram or YouTube or whatever it is, but this is an example of a reflexive fight or flight behavior. We've got the right hemisphere being dominant in the left visual field, and the animal taking an avoidance reflex away from the stimulus. Now, the stimulus is just a cucumber put down by their owner, and this became, I think, a fairly prevalent game to play with your house cat. But you can see that there is a reflexive motion to escape to the right. Now, if information is not urgent, it can pass to the left hemisphere, and we became good at doing structured sequences of action with the left hemisphere, like feeding behaviors. And you can see, if you watch this slowly, you'll see that the mouse isn't actually captured until it goes into the right visual field in the left hemisphere. And most of these studies have been done on animals with side-positioned eyes, so you could say definitively which hemisphere was dominant for the behavior. And this tends to work too with even just using digital media to present stimuli to frogs. I'm seeing that they actually turn to give preference to the right eye and the left visual field. And it actually turns out that they neglect stimuli in the opposite visual field. So if they had something approaching, like the mouse approaching in the left eye, right hemisphere, they tend to do something called pseudo-neglect, which often means they just ignore the stimuli there until it comes into view on the opposite side. Obviously, we know that it's a little bit simplistic to say that the left and the right hemispheres unilaterally control behavior on the opposite side. Nevertheless, if you have a dominance in one hemisphere, it can be detected in the naturalistic behaviors of humans and other animals. So, why are these evolutionarily old contexts, or these old motor behaviors of interest to cognition? Well, we now understand that motor development plays a really significant role in the development of the individual, and that's because we think that any sort of abstract or higher cognitive function actually scaffolds off of our early primary and motor sensory abilities. But that's not just true for the development of the individual, we think that's also true within the evolution of the species. So initially we would have had primary and motor sensory abilities, and building on top of these, we provide a platform for more and more abstract cognitive capabilities. So the hypothesis that I'm going to put to you today and talk about with examples of motor biases is that this distinguishing of capabilities by the left and right hemisphere, the right hemisphere for fight and flight, and the left hemisphere for your basic motor structures, made a really good kind of eat and not be eaten parallel processor. You could escape from predators while eating and maintain survival. But they also laid a platform for all of our higher cognitive functions. And that if we look at our more modern social emotional processes, we might say that our early fight or flight capabilities laid a foundation or a platform for social emotional processes to sit upon. In the same way, we might say that our early structured sequences of actions that we used initially just to basic feeding behaviors and other sequential actions might have laid the foundation for higher cognitive functions that require structured sequences of actions like language. And these now sit within those specific hemispheres depending on what the foundation mechanism is. So I'm going to talk to you about those specific types of examples using hand dominance and visual field dominances. So the first examples I'm going to give you are about right hand dominance and left hemisphere associations, specifically tied to language capabilities, and thinking about it within an evolutionary framework, and then also give you some examples of typical cognitive development and atypical cognitive development. And then we'll flip, and I'll show you some examples of left hand and visual field dominances tied to right hemisphere dominant capabilities, specifically within social emotional processing, and also give you a couple examples of development in typical and atypical processing. Okay. So I'll just start by saying handedness is a lot more complex than I think most people think. You guys here probably know a bit more about it than most. But how many of you would consider yourselves to be right-handed? Okay, and what do you base that upon? Does anybody want to tell me? Writing. Okay, so most people agree with that? Writing? Okay. So there is this long-held belief that, that handedness is a causal result of our left hemisphere regions for language. And this is something that's been long held within the scientific community. But I think the more we learn about hand dominance, the more we can kind of debunk that assumption. So here you go. Speaking leads to right-handedness. If we look at archaeological data, we know that humans have been tool users for about 3.3 million years. So if you look at this side here, we've been tool users for 3.3 million years, banging rocks together and making arrowheads or flint knapping. And then about 100,000 years ago, things changed, and our tools became more sophisticated, and we do what's called hafting. We tie things together with different materials. And this is how archaeologists define when language occurred. They suggest that 100,000 years ago, you have a change in the way tools were made, and these were too sophisticated to just pass down those technologies through generations or laterally, so we must have had a sophisticated communication system. Because language doesn't fossilize, we can't dig it up, and these are assumptions that have been made. So if language wasn't necessarily around until about 100,000 years ago, yet if you look at the flint knapping archaeological bits, the archaeologists have determined that there's a disproportionate amount of them that show right-handedness. So we had right-handedness already prevalent within the population just by looking at the angles which they're knapped, long, long before language seemed to emerge. We also know that all 4 species of great apes, orangutans, bonobos, chimpanzees, and gorillas, have human homologs for Broca's and Wernicke's areas, which are our language areas for production and comprehension, and yet they don't have language. So there's not a direct tie between language and handedness. So there are some speculations about where handedness did come from, and it's more related to a left hemisphere predisposition for structured sequences of actions. The primary one is called the tool use theory, and the notion is that tool use laid a foundation for language through having goal-directed sequences of actions. So if you think about doing something really simple like hammering a nail, you have to do the actions in the correct sequence to get the goal. And if you don't do them in the correct sequence, you don't get the goal. And this has been likened to a proto-syntax with words for a sentence. If you put the words in the right order, you can have the anticipated meaning. And if you don't put them in the right order, the intended meaning might not be gleaned. And therefore, researchers consider tool use to have been a really interesting and potentially likely catalyst for a language system, in that you have this proto-action syntax for using tools. But of course, if this is the case, we would think maybe that apes should be then right-handed as well, because they're also tool users. And if they're tool users and that's being actually processed or conducted more by the left hemisphere, then we should expect apes to be right-handed like humans. So who thinks apes are right-handed like humans? 1, 2, we're not sure. Historically, the research says no, but the research has been confounded by methodological issues. When we test humans for handedness, we say which hand do you write with, or we give you the Edinburgh Handedness Inventory, which gives you about 10 questions about tool use. Which hand do you light a match? Which hand do you throw a ball? Which hand is your upper hand when you sweep with a broom? And of course, we cannot give the same task to animals. And so we've developed different ways to test animal handedness, which has included a much larger range of behaviors than the specific tool use ones that we've done with humans. And so therefore, there hasn't been very good efficacy with the ecological validity of comparing these. Here's a little anecdotal evidence that apes are right-handed. Should be volume, but I can't hit. Poor grandma. Okay, silly anecdotal evidence, but we've looked at handedness in apes across different species and created a methodology that it would allow us to directly compare the results to humans. Specifically, we used a study that looked at unimanual handedness. Unimanual handedness is when you have both hands free and you choose one of the hands to do something. So we just looked simply to see if the individual, when both hands were free and were reaching towards an inanimate object, if they chose the left or the right hand. So very simple. And the hypothesis was that if you're going to reach for an object, most objects require manipulation, and you're going to go for your dominant hand for manipulation, or the thing that it's inanimate. Whereas we did not make that prediction if they were going to reach towards a conspecific, so another member of their group, or towards themselves. So we looked at a group of Western lowland gorillas. They're a biological family group. They're in captivity, but they're as close as you get to the dynamics of a wild ape group in captivity. And we looked at a group of chimpanzees, also in captivity, and a group of children in a school. And we just counted the frequencies of their handedness to, does this work? No. Maybe if I turn it on, it will. Ah, yeah. So we just looked at their handedness to animate and inanimate things. And we found with the gorillas that if we just looked at their hand dominance to when they were making social handed gestures, not necessarily gestures, but if they were reaching to a conspecific or to themselves, that they used either hand with equal frequency. But if they were reaching for an inanimate object, they had a significant right hand bias. So I thought that wasn't so surprising, and this was a nice result based on the hypotheses. Our group of chimpanzees did exactly the same thing. If they were doing social handedness, they were ambipreferent. And if they were reaching towards an inanimate object, they were right-handed. What about children? What do you think? Same, or do you think you guys are right-handed also for everything? And indeed, the same result. Even more right-handed for objects, but you could argue that humans have many more objects in their environment and are experienced tool users, so maybe we've exaggerated that right-handedness for tools. But it does say that humans are not right-handed within all contexts. So when you think about being right-handed, it is context-specific to your left hemisphere's ability to produce sequences of actions. If you look at yourselves while you're all just sitting there doing this, it's usually not your right hand that's pulling on your hair, picking your nose, or rubbing your chin, or maybe reaching out to a friend. So handedness does seem to be inherited, but it is domain-specific and driven by left hemisphere cerebral lateralization of fine motor action. So we're seeing it is in animals. You can see this, these are the gorillas, tool using in captivity here at Port Lim Wild Animal Park. And they're very, very right-handed for their tool using behaviors. But research has also shown that they're also right-handed for gesturing. So this is just a natural conversation going on between two gorillas, a mom and her son, at Port Lim Wild Animal Park. And you can see that there's definitely a right-handed preference here for the gesturing. This isn't so surprising because one of the primary theories about the origins of language is that we went from hand to mouth. This is called the gestural origin theory. And the notion is that as we became, is that working? As we became bipedal, we started using our hands for tool use, and using gestures as a way to communicate became a competition for tool use and communication, and therefore eventually we moved from hands to the mouth for our gesturing. And the evidence that supports this is that if we look at the neuroanatomical data from imaging, we know that the area for tool use and the area for speech highly overlap around Broca's region. So this is a nice bit of neuroanatomical data. But what behavioral evidence exists that the left hemisphere has a link with mouth and hand to support this as well? There were a few studies in the early 2000s by Gintalucci and colleagues, another Italian group, that wanted to show that the hand and the mouth really are linked behaviorally, and that this still actually manifests in modern humans. It's not just an evolutionarily old sort of thing. And they showed very simply that when they asked participants to pick up small things using a pincer grip, so really small things that require a pinch, their mouths closed. So they became small in the lips. They were mimicking the hand grasp. And they could have them say a vowel that also mimicked a closed vowel sound and brought the lips together, and that was all fine. They would have them pick up larger things, and unbeknownst to the participants, their mouths were still again shadowing their grasp, and they were fine at saying a phoneme that opened their mouth. But when the investigators asked them to keep a small grip and make a large phoneme, or vice versa, there was interference in the mouth. They couldn't do the phoneme if it was incongruent with the size of their hand, showing that the mouth and the hands are definitely interrelated. The motor area that controls, the brain area that controls the motor activity of these two areas, and it looks like the hand is dominant, so maybe it was the first for gesture, and the mouth seems to shadow. Of course, we never make studies that are nicely cross-species, but there was a study with apes that showed a similar sort of thing. This is Waters and Fouts, and they showed that when apes are using a pincer like human grip, and they do this, like humans mostly not the same, they tend to do it on the side, this bottom one here. It is a pincer grip, but they use the side of their hand. They noticed that the apes were also doing mouth movements when they made this behavior, but when they used power grips, they were using much less mouth movement. So if it was a fine motor articulation, lots of mouth shadowing. And if it was a power grip, like young pre-verbal children do, there was very much less mouth shadowing. So the idea is that you've got this link between mouth articulation and hand articulation. And the more precise it is, the more mouth movements you get. We did our own little studies looking at this with children. We were looking at a completely different thing, but had lots of video of children doing a NEPSI test. So this is a battery of cognitive tasks. And these were 4 to 5-year-old children. And we noticed that while they were doing the tasks, they were sticking their tongues out just a little bit, like this. Does anybody stick their tongue out when they're doing certain tasks? Yeah. It's very common in children up to about the age of 8, and typically developing children. And lots of adults do it too, but probably because of social pressures, we stop sticking it really far out there because we don't want to embarrass ourselves. But we found that these children were definitely doing this behavior very frequently. But when we actually broke down the tasks between fine motor and gross motor tasks and looked at how much tongue protrusions they were making, we found that they were making tongue protrusions during both fine motor and gross motor tasks. But there was a difference in the lateral bias of the tongue protrusion based on whether or not they were fine or gross motor. So when they were gross motor, there tended to be no lateral bias. Is everybody familiar with the laterality index? So on a laterality index, you have between -1 and +1, with 0 being ambipreferent, +1 being fully right-sided, and -1 being fully left-sided. So this one here, gross motor, sitting near 0, means that the tongue protrusions that they made during gross motor behaviors were both sides with equal preference. But the tongue protrusions that they made during fine motor activities, that one, were significantly right-sided. So we're saying with the more articulation of the right hand, the actual laterality, you got a lateral bias out of the tongue also going towards the right, suggesting that, again, it's the left hemisphere that's dictating these behaviors and tying the mouth and the hand together. So nice support for the gestural origins of language theory. As somebody who's interested in the evolution of cognitive capabilities, this makes me think, well, we really need to reassess what Broca's region is. It doesn't appear to be a language-dominant region. It does deal with language, but language was not its primary focus. It seems to be an area that is dealing with a lot of things that require structured sequences of action and fine articulation of the hands and the mouth. And we see that it has homologous areas in primates. So it seems that rather than hand dominance being a causal effect of language, language is just sitting upon that left hemisphere region that's already dominant for fine action sequences and just happens to share the right-handedness. Okay. Some people are calling it a supramodal hierarchical processor instead of Broca's region, which sounds quite fancy. Okay, so what about moving more to a development side of things? The development of motor ability and cognition. Oh, baby's swirling. So traditionally, motor development has been investigated in isolation of social and communication abilities. But we know that in typically developing children, there is an association between motor abilities and subsequent cognitive attainment. Specifically, that if you meet your motor milestones, like when do you stand and crawl and walk, these are closely associated with typical development if you're meeting them. But if you're not meeting them, it's typically associated with poorer subsequent cognitive attainment. What we think might be happening, in a nutshell, is that if you inhibit early motor development, you're actually inhibiting the perspective from which the child sees the world. So if you have poor motor capability, you're lifting your head later, you're sitting later, you're standing later, and therefore your interactions with the world are delayed. Your understanding of texture, edges, depth, and all of these basic percepts are different from a child who has met their motor milestones. And we think that this difference doesn't just go away, but it cascades and impacts upon all future development of cognitive function. Well, what about the development of cerebral lateralization? We know it's evolutionarily old. How early can we see it in the development of children? Very, very early. It is thought that they appear in typical populations during infancy. And we know that by the time we can test kids for fine motor and language skills, they're already lateralized. But what about kids with autism spectrum disorders? These children are typically diagnosed at 4, maybe 3, and it's usually based on their language capabilities, so their ability to comprehend and produce language. But if we look at reports of children with ASD diagnoses, we'll see that parents, teachers, clinicians have all noted that they have some sort of motor disruption early on, and that these are quite visible from infancy. So some describe it as like having, picking up a sack of flour. They're a different sort of posture, even at the baby level. And then walking, the gait is slightly different and awkward in comparison to typically developing children. But these are not reported in a systematic fashion. We do know, though, that these children manifest deficits in motor planning, including poor imitation, coordination, and there's comorbidity of ASDs with dyslexia, dyspraxia, and DCD. So one thing that's been hypothesized is that potentially children with ASD actually have hypolateralization. So they have a lack or a weakened lateralization of the two hemispheres, and that this has impacted the development of their social and cognitive capabilities. So if we take a neo-constructivist view, like that of Annette Karmeloff-Smith's work, we would expect that if cerebral lateralization fails to develop, it's going to influence and cascade upon the rest of your cognitive capabilities. So here's your motor sensory, and if we have abnormal development, say we break something in the motor cerebral lateralization, we might expect that it's going to then impact laterally, and as we go up the scale towards more and more complex and abstract cognitive capabilities. Whether or not these anomalies cause the cognitive deficits or they act as biomarkers, that's one of those chicken and egg situations I can't answer for you, but at least understanding the timing of these events will help us understand the primary mechanisms and the causes of disorders. So what have we seen in the behavioral literature? There's been a lot of literature on hand dominance in children with and without autism. The general conclusions are that if you have strong lateralization, that you get typical and earlier language capabilities. So that's left or right. It used to be that if you were left-handed, you were thought to maybe be at higher risk for cognitive and mental health disorders. The more recent research suggests that it doesn't matter if you're lateralized left or right, just so long as you're lateralized, because that means you have a good division of labor between the two hemispheres. So we see reduced hand dominance in kids, in populations of children with ASD, and it has been associated also with impaired cognitive function. And this rises from something like 4% of ambidextrous in the typical population to between 17 and 20% in populations of children with ASD. Okay. We ourselves, in my lab, have looked a little bit at this. You know that study I showed you earlier with the chimpanzees, gorillas, and children doing unimanual actions towards objects or the self? We did the same thing comparing typically developing children with children who've been diagnosed with ASD. And our typically developing children, as we already saw, are significantly right-handed for objects, reaching towards objects. But we found our children who are diagnosed with ASD actually showed no lateral preference at all. And this is across kind of hundreds of trials of reaching towards objects. So does decreased hand dominance actually associate with their cognitive capabilities, though? Is there a direct link? We've looked briefly at knock-on effects of lack of laterality of hand dominance with their actual cognitive outcomes. And we did this little pilot study at Swiss Cottage School in London here, looking at children with ASD, asking them to do a rather simple task of taking these little teddy bears and placing them into the correct colored plates, and to do it as fast as they can, and they required a kind of halfway pincer grip to do this. We counted the amount of errors and the time it took them to do this as well. And then separately, we had their teachers blindly fill out a survey where we calculated the expressive language scores of these individual children. And then we wanted to see if there was a correlation between their ability to do this motor action task and their expressive language capabilities. This was another task that we combined with it, the card lacing. This requires very fine motor action. And we found that even with this really small handful of children, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 children, that the motor sequencing correct, so we looked at the correct score, was positively correlated with their expressive language score. So the better they did on these tasks, the less errors that they made, the higher their expressive language scores was. So obviously this is not a causal relation, this is a correlation, but it suggests that this is an interesting area to explore further. Okay, so that's left hemisphere right side biases, and I'm going to dip into, just for a little bit, right biases and, sorry, I get this wrong, left side biases and right hemisphere dominances, because it's something that's far less talked about. We hear loads about right-handedness and why the population is right-handed, but we don't hear loads about why we are left biased for things, and we are indeed. In fact, our social emotional processing is highly left side bias across the population, giving a dominance to the right hemisphere. And this can be seen both in our hand activities and our visual field biases. Now, human emotion theories, you're probably already familiar with these, so I won't talk about them much, but there's two primary human emotion theories, one being the right hemisphere theory, which suggests that the right hemisphere is dominant for all types of social emotional processing. And the valence theory is suggesting that the two hemispheres are differently processing social emotional information, in that the right hemisphere processes negative emotion and the left hemisphere processes positive emotion. Well, I'm going to mainly focus on negative emotion in the kind of relationship of threat and fear within the evolutionary framework. So we're talking about right hemisphere, which fits fine. They're not contrasting in theory in that respect. But of course, you might see that this is a human emotion theory rather than a vertebrate emotion theory. With visual fields, I'm sure you know this all already as well, we've got the right visual field that's going to project to the left hemisphere and vice versa. So it's a little bit different when we think about it than just crossing the body. We've got a right and left visual field in each eye. So both our eyes need the left visual, the right hemisphere has control over the left visual field of both eyes, and vice versa. There's a lot of human emotion processing data out there. A lot of it comes from the 1970s with Paul Ekman and his studies to show that the right hemisphere is indeed dominant in humans. So if I were to just ask you, do you see this face or this face as happier Hands up if you think this one is. And hands up if you think this one is. OK, so a massive majority for this one. Does anybody know what these are? Yeah, they're the chimeric faces, meaning that this is a left-left composite. So this is two left sides of this gentleman's face stuck together. And this is two right sides of this gentleman's face stuck together. The reason why we see this as more happy appearing is because the right side of the brain is more efficient and effective at producing emotion on the opposite side of the face. So for all of you, your faces are not symmetric. For those who are right-handed, most of you will have social emotional processes dominant in the right hemisphere, and therefore the left side of your face is going to be more expressive than the other side. So if we took two of your left sides and put them together, they're going to be more expressive than the other side. And this is how we can see that the expression production is right hemisphere dominant. But it's not just for production, it's also for perceiving emotion. And this is done in a laboratory situation where you would be face front to this. But which one of these faces do you find the left, what side is it to you? Your left side to be happier? This one or this one? Who says A? Yeah. So A is, for most people, the happier one. And the interesting thing is that A and B are exactly the same. They're just swapped around. So the neutral bit of the face is the same on both, and the expression is the same on both sides, on both slides. The difference is that you're viewing it in a different hemisphere, or with a preference. Yeah?
Would that be the same for, let's say, people from Israel who read from right to left?
It would be a visual field dominance, so I think it would probably interfere with the reading, but there are potentially cultural differences that will get involved in confounding things a little bit. But we haven't seen that there is a difference for right-handedness and left hemisphere differences across all sorts of communities, even pre-linguistic ones. So it's probably too robust to be influenced in that way, but it's a good question. Right, so this shows you that you also perceive with the dominance of the right hemisphere. And this is not human specific. If we look at animals, we know that sheep, dogs, and chimpanzees also perceive better with the left visual field, which is usually in the side animals really easy to check, but even in the front-facing eyes, it's the left visual field, right hemisphere. They're quicker to identify members of their own group than using the opposite visual field. But also production, and primarily from the ape literature. We can do this with humans as well. But if you get an ape or a monkey to produce a facial expression, you can actually measure the area on the left and the right side, and you find that the left side is bigger and more expressive than the right side, just like in humans. So here's my argument, really, that social emotional processing has a foundation in right hemisphere fight or flight behaviors. We think of humans as being special maybe for having the right-sided fusiform face area, and we think of human social emotional processing as the valence theory or the right hemisphere theory, and it's never really thought about within an evolutionary framework of other animals. But actually, if we look at the work of Valletagara and colleagues that I spoke about earlier, there's a plethora of data from fish and frogs and lizards and birds and chicks and dolphins that show that they also have a left eye bias to monitor conspecifics. So they're having this same sort of right hemisphere bias that humans have. So I would suggest that humans are not special in this way. We've just potentially extended it for our higher cognitive functions. So we wanted to test how much maybe this evolutionarily old right hemisphere bias for noticing conspecifics is in modern humans and apes. So these were two really simple studies that we did with chimpanzees and gorillas, the same groups that we did the handedness studies with. And we simply wanted to know that if a chimpanzee or a gorilla in their natural social environment, if they were going to pass a stationary individual and they had equal opportunity to pass them on the left or the right to get to some point beyond, would they have a preference to pass them on the left or the right side of space, bearing in mind our understanding of the differences in processing of the two hemispheres? So who would like to have a guess? Would you prefer to pass on the left or the right, and what benefit would it give you? If I'm passing on the left side of an individual, I'm going to give a dominance to my right visual field and left hemisphere. And if I pass an individual on the right, I'm going to give a dominance to my left visual field and my right hemisphere. And indeed, that's exactly what we found that the gorillas did. And when we tested it again with the chimpanzees, we found that they were doing the same thing too. We were just as interested to see if kids did a similar thing, and we looked at children in playgrounds and schools. And when we were doing the work with children, we were able to manipulate the environment so we could have a control condition. And our control condition was a bin. So we could say, right, if we put a bin somewhere out in the playground, make sure there's equal opportunity to pass on either side. It's a rather symmetrical environment, and they need to go somewhere beyond. Are they going to prefer to pass on the left or the right of the bin? And we found that they passed either side with equal frequency when it was a bin. When we replaced the bin with a peer, and we tried with children and adults, we found that they had a significant preference to pass on the right. And that was quite an interesting finding, very simple and matching the apes. We also have an arm bias when it comes to cradling. I don't know if we have a name for it, Armedness, I've called it there, but it sounds ridiculous. So the human population has a left side cradling bias. Now, there have been lots of theories about cradling. Some of them suggest that we would cradle to the left because the heart is there, and we want to synchronize heartbeats with the baby. Some think that you cradle to the left for most of the population to keep the right hand free, because the majority of the population are right-handed. But through a sequence of studies, we've been able to factor those things out. And the only thing remaining that seems viable is that if you keep the baby on the left, the carer has a direct left visual field, right hemisphere route to monitor the well-being of the child. And this is what we think is likely to be happening. So the study that colleagues of mine have done more recently looked at babies being reared from 0 to 12 weeks and then beyond. And it seems like this is a critical period, the 0 to 12 weeks, where there's very much a bias for the left side cradling, which disappears after that point in time. My PhD student has just come up with some new data that's preliminary that suggests that in children with ASD, it returns from 6 to 9 months. So maybe the mums realize there's something wrong and they want to monitor further. So this is ongoing research. But it's not specific to humans. Apes also cradle with a preference to the left side, and cross species as well. So left cradle bias is a more efficient way to monitor the state of the baby. The other nice thing is that for the baby, they get to see the more expressive side of the mother's face, because it's the left side of the face that's going to produce the more expressive, more salient features when you're producing an expression. And again, this goes back within different animal species. There are these mother-baby side preferences. In many other species, we see that actually there's a preference of the baby to keep the mum on the left side, and it's the baby that's doing the monitoring. But other species are very different from humans in that they start locomoting or transporting very, very soon after birth. So it's the baby's job to keep up with the mums, whereas humans were born very prematurely because our large heads, and it seems to be the carer's job to monitor the baby. So what knock-on effects could cradling have on infants? Do we see that it improves or degrades their ability to develop social emotional capabilities later in life? There's only been one study that's looked at this specifically, and this study by Vervloyd and colleagues, they looked at adults who know whether or not they've been cradled on the left or the right, and then they tested them using those chimeric faces that I showed you earlier to see if they had a left or right visual field dominance for identifying both individuals and identifying the type of expressions made. And they found that children who were right side cradled, even though they still had a left visual field right hemisphere preference, like the left cradled babies, as adults, they were significantly slower at identifying the facial expressions and the identities of individuals compared to those that were cradled left. And this was true both for identity and emotion. So I don't know if you want to call it a deficit. They were still able to do it. It was still left visual field right hemisphere bias, but it was significantly slower than the left cradled counterparts. Okay. And then here's a little bit of data from a study that we did to say, well, what does this mean for like handedness as well? Is there social handedness? We talked about the fact that the apes and the kids were ambipreferent when they were doing unimanual reaching to conspecifics or the self. And so we decided that we'd look at their unimanual reaching just to the self when we had them in a rather stressful environment. And the stressful environment was that they were sitting at a table doing the ADOS. And we wanted to see what their self-directed behaviors were going to be like. So a self-directed behavior is just when you touch yourself, pull on your clothes or your hair, but there's no functional need for it, as we know. It's not object manipulation. But when both hands are free and they directed a hand towards themselves, which hand was it? And was there a difference between the children who were typically developing and those who were diagnosed with ASD? And we found that our typically developing boys were actually left-hand preferent for self-directed touching during a stressful situation. But like before, we found our children with ASD, not only did they do self-directed touching less, they were ambipreferent across the board. So again, a lack of lateralization of handedness tied to social emotional processing. So I'll just wrap with some conclusions. I think cerebral lateralization and the contralateral motor biases are present and observable very early in life. They seem to be less visible or less present in children who are diagnosed with ASD than their counterparts, leading us with a way to potentially find behavioral markers of ASD much earlier than we currently diagnose children based on their communication abilities. Cerebral lateralization can shed light on our evolutionary different cognitive capabilities, but also on our developmental ones. And as I've said here, it might help us find out earlier whether or not children might be at risk for neurodevelopmental disorders. So I'll just close with saying, looking at humans outside of an evolutionary framework can cause some problems. It doesn't give us as wide of a scope as potentially if we look at evolution as a continuum across vertebrates, because we all have those same cognitive capabilities. And if you haven't seen this one, I like it. It doesn't matter where the target is, they're all right-handed. Okay, and I'll thank my collaborators and students who've helped put this work together. So thank you for your attention.